entanglement does not mean that one particle, atomic particle, uh, escapes the speed of light and is able to simultaneously interact with another particle billions of light years away. He says that at one time these particles were together, that they were entangled, and then they became separate. And so that's why one can influence the other. So Kammerer's whole take on seriality is that this is a law of unity, that there is no such thing as metaphysical and science. I want to unite physics and religion, if you will, and make a law of seriality that can create world peace. Kammerer was a pacifist, and he was an anti-war advocate. And again, he was half Jewish. He was discriminated against, whether he committed suicide or whether he was suicided, because there is some conspiracy about that. We don't know. But he did come up with a lot of theories to suggest that what would later come out as retrocausality, that you can go back in time, that there is no such thing as time, that we are timeless, and that we can influence things that happened in the past, which doesn't make any sense at all because we wouldn't be here. So you have to think about these things.
Welcome to Connecting with Coincidence. I am your host, Bernard Beitman, MD. I love studying meaningful coincidences. The forerunner of synchronicity was a guy named Paul Kammerer, who lived in Vienna and wrote about coincidences well before Jung did. And he's got some very good ideas in there, but his book, The Law of Seriality, was written in German, and now we have Jason Bulkeley, who translated it. And that's amazing because it's a fat book, and he'll show you what it looks like. But first, Jason Bulkeley served in the Department of Defense as a translator and intelligence analyst. So he's very much interested in words and meaning and how things are understood or misunderstood. He kind of takes things apart, and you'll see that he analyzes words for their symbolic meaning, just like not just a translator, but a guy trying to understand the meaning of codes. He received during the Cold War, and has a degree in English and Linguistics from the University of Maryland. He translated and published numerous books from Russian to English, which is not easy, on scientific and human interest topics. He ran a restaurant for over 20 years, which spurred his interest in coincidence and synchronicity, because a lot of weird people came in there and had some good stories, and they came from all over the world. He now has an international online store on eBay, specializing in rare books on philosophy, history, and metaphysical topics. And Jason, please hold up that fat book you've just translated.
Yeah, it's pretty fat. It's about 570 pages, including about a 20-page bibliography of about 200 to 400 books, which Kammerer based his research on. It's unprecedented.
This guy was a biologist, Paul Kammerer, and a polymath, meaning he knew a lot of stuff. That's why he got all those references. So here you are, Department of Defense translator, interested in decoding language. And somehow you got into Paul Kammerer, who's not been well known. Jung's got most of the publicity for various reasons. There were Jungians making Jung more famous, and there are not Kammerers for various reasons. And Kammerer, and we might get to this, committed suicide. Not too old. How old was he? About this?
He was
30s?
46.
46.
Here's a picture of him. Here's a picture. A biography.
That's Paul. Yeah, that's okay. Thank you. That's Paul Kammerer in Vienna, prolific researcher. He was accused of falsifying some information, which probably didn't happen, may have led to a suicide, and we got to wonder why a right-handed guy committed suicide into his left part of his brain. How'd that happen? there's a lot of mysteries about Paul Kammerer, and the big mystery here is, hey, Jason, why'd you do this?
Well, I did this because of my own personality. I found an affinity to Paul Kammerer when I read about him, and how I heard about him was through a book called Synchronicity by F. David Peat in a used bookstore. And I also encountered your book there, Connecting with Coincidence, in which Paul Kammerer was mentioned. And so I said, well, I've got to read about this guy because he sounds like me. He was a polyglot, and I am too. As a matter of fact, Kammerer knew the same languages that I do, all of them, and all of them are featured in this book. So when I went to go find a copy of his book to find out more about him, it was in German. And I said, well, I can read this, but I'd rather read it in English. And so I said, well, geez, I used to be a German translator, so let me translate this and see how far I can get. And I became so obsessed with him, his life, his personality, that it just grew on me, almost like we were meant to connect in the afterlife. I would keep a radio on and playing classical music as I was translating. And invariably, when I would translate, I would hear a Strauss waltz, the Blue Danube play. And of course, Kammerer was from, Austria, and he knew Strauss. He also knew Freud, Jung, and Einstein. And I was like, wow, this guy was extremely well connected. He was part of the Vienna circle, and he knew everyone. And physics, psychology, psychiatry, everything. And he was interested literally in everything, like me. And yet he was also an eccentric like me. So I, as I became obsessed with him, I just started. I didn't even realize how long it took me. It took me 2 years to translate the book, and I had a ball doing it. I was exhausted. I had sleepless nights, and I had to edit it myself and publish it myself. But I did it. I felt like it was a calling. So yeah, and sometimes I would translate. I don't mean to go on in too much detail, but I think it's fascinating because the translation of the book formed a series of coincidences. And with me, I would translate a passage about Jerome, Three Men in a Boat. And a few minutes later, a friend of mine who didn't know I was translating that passage sent me an email or a message on Messenger saying that he had heard an opera of Three Men on the Boat just a while ago. And I said, that is so bizarre. So, in other words, I felt the book had some magical properties to it.
Well,
And
let's talk about that a little bit more, because what I want our viewers and listeners to know is that once you start getting into the meaningful coincidence thing, you become more alert to them, for one thing. But there's also some way that they come in more. It's like
yes.
you tap into something where they happen. So that Jerome one is just part of and illustrates a common thing. It's not may not mean too much, generally speaking, but it's what happens. But let's go on. Let's go on to what Paul Kammerer meant by seriality.
Okay, well, seriality, the original word in German is Serien, which means series. So it's really a mathematical term. For instance, the Fibonacci series, there are a series in mathematics that are really important for quadratic equations and physics. And so you can't say it. And basically, the Germans didn't have a word for coincidence. Synchronicity came out later, but he meant to use the word series or Serien, or I translated it as seriality because it sounds less of a mathematical word and more of a philosophical word or a generic word. So I choose that word. But it represents a series of events, or a clustering, if you will, or an entanglement of things that are in a set order. So the set order corresponds to a kind of a law, because in mathematics you have laws and the formulas that have to be followed to attain your result. So if in coincidences, usually we'll hear a series of events. For instance, I mentioned, Jerome. Okay, that's one, and then there's two. A friend of mine says it, and then maybe the next day I'll see it again. Here's an example of a series, and I don't want to use examples from the book because they're somewhat outdated, but I can say the same thing in my own life. One day, customer came in or called on the phone, and his name was Zach, and he ordered a carryout. 5 minutes later, another guy named Zach calls and orders the exact same thing. The exact same thing, you see. So that's a strange thing. And I said, well, I already took your order. And he goes, no, I haven't ordered before. And I was like, okay, well, it's the same order. And I tried not to screw it up. An hour later, another guy named Zach calls in with something else. And I said, that's just bizarre. Okay, so that is a series, a seriality, if you will, a chain, a link, of improbable events. And so that's what seriality means.
So, and let's, so you make clear about the way I look at coincidences. Seriality is a subtype of coincidences, and the other ones are synchronicity, in which it's usually a mental event with an objective event, or it can be serendipity, which is finding something in unexpected way. And there are mental and objective events in there too, but they're a little different in how they happen. Seriality is a third form of coincidence. They are objective events that anyone could see. Like you could have recorded that there are the three Zachs called up. And so those were objective events. So Paul Kammerer tended to do observational connections, not mental and objective or mind and object connections. And so this guy studied a version of meaningful coincidences that most people don't pay a lot of attention to. So let's now we've defined that. Let's go through what I think is a very amazing coincidence that you told me about with Nadia, and then we'll go into like how Kammerer thought these serial coincidences took place.
Yeah, here's an example of an incredible, what I think is it's a subjective
It's
coincidence because it relates to me. So other people may say, I'm, I have to tell you what I'm talking about when I say Nadia. Andre Breton wrote a book called Nadia in 1926 or 27, the same year that Paul Kammerer died. He was the founder of surrealism. And again, in seriality, there is a lot of surrealism involved, like the Jerome thing, the Zach thing. These are surreal events, and so this was the end of World War I when a lot of surreal things happened. People were dropping bombs from planes. There was, biological chemical warfare. There was the influenza. A lot of people were walking around the streets of Paris with, no faces, no arms, no legs. Very surreal. Salvador Dali at the time was thriving. It was sort of an ironic statement about, society at the time. That so Andre Breton wrote this book called Nadia as sort of his take on surrealism, as his manifesto of surrealism. It was about a homeless woman who was wandering the streets of Paris. She had abandoned her husband and her parents. She had some money, but left it all behind. She was a poet. She had been involved in cocaine, and she had just been in a sanitarium, which is a mental institution. Andre Breton met her and fell in love with her and spent some time with her. But then he realized that it was just too much for him, and she uttered some strange comments like, "Nadia, who are you?" And she said, "I am the soul in limbo." And he says, "Oh, I've got to write this down. This will be a great, take on my surrealism. I can." And his Breton was married at the time, and said, "Oh, you should continue this affair with this girl because she can inspire you to such greatness." And so so anyway, Nadia disappeared, and he never pursued her because he realized, you know what, I should just leave her to her own destiny. But I'm going to write about her, and she's going to be my inspiration. So as I was reading this book, I was obsessed with it. And again, when you're obsessed with something, such as Paul Kammerer, he seems to manifest himself, or Zachs will manifest themselves when you're thinking about them. So as I was thinking about this book, and I stopped reading it or put it away, and I didn't read the ending. Into my restaurant walks this young lady that I had known years ago, and I didn't recognize her. And she seemed destitute and disheveled. And I said, yeah, can I help you? And she was carrying some luggage. And she goes, it's me, Nadia. And I said, oh my God, you've changed so much. What happened? She goes, well, I'm homeless now. And I was just released from a psychiatric institution. I've had some problems. I got involved in some drugs. But I write marvelous poetry, and I do these drawings. And she started drawing. And I looked at her drawings, and in the book Nadia by Andre Breton, she would invent these little drawings like a girl in a hat. She would draw similar drawings to that. And as I asked her more and more about herself, I just realized, it dawned on me that, oh my God, she corresponds in almost every way to this girl called Nadia by Andre Breton. I said, did you ever read this book? And she goes, never heard of it before. So anyway, as I'm reading the book, I get back into it. And in the meantime, I decide to take her in. So she stays. I said, you can stay one night. So one night turns into a week, and then a week turns into several months, and there were ups and downs. And anyway, the upshot of it is, as I was getting to the end of the book, I realized that he couldn't put up with her anymore. And it was, in the end, it was in October. And there are actually dates in the book that corresponded to the current date, or the current month, which is October. On October 11th, I was having an argument with her, and I opened up the book randomly, and it was October 11th was the date that I opened it up to in the diary entry. And some of the details in the dialogue corresponded to a conversation that we had. So at that point in time, I put the book down. I said, I don't want to know how it ends. A few days later on Halloween, she had an episode, a meltdown, and left. And then I started reading the book, and then I realized, oh my God, that was around the same time, the end of October, that the Nadia in this book in 1926 or 24 had a meltdown and left. Almost 1926, actually the same year that Kammerer died, had a meltdown, and he never saw her again. So now the same thing happened to this Nadia. I didn't know where she was, but I found her. So she's still alive. She's still out there, as was the original Nadia. But he does not want to get in touch with her in the book, and he leaves her be. So this same thing is happening to me because they will not let me contact her. I did not plan any of this. I would like to write about it because Breton did. So maybe that'll be my next book. I don't know, but I'm still
Well,
trying to.
well, what you do with it is something else. You've just done something with it. You've told a seriality
Right.
of us of you read the book, and yeah, it's your seriality. You have to have a mind to connect the events, but there's a book and there's a woman, so it is a fitting seriality, objective. Anybody could see the book. People who know you could know there was a Nadia in your life, so it's objective, and the details you have to put together. But here you ran into someone who you knew in the past, who knew you, who walks into your restaurant, and it's one of those, I'm living a novel, you might say.
Yeah.
And as I've lived cartoons and comic strips that when this happens, you begin to wonder, like, is somebody orchestrating this? I mean, you kind of like have to wonder that. And this is what human beings tend to do anyway, is there's somebody's orchestrated. You usually say God is doing it, but we want to get we want to get a better answer than just what God is. And here this happened to Jason,
Yeah.
and the same thing happened to the author, Paul, uh, that
Oh,
what
Andre Breton. Yeah. Andre Breton.
Andre Baton
Yeah. Yeah.
happened
Yeah.
to Andre Baton. So so Andre Baton and Jason Bulkeley had similar, very similar experiences with not Zach's,
Right.
three
Right.
Zachs or Jerome. You had the name and so much more detail that overlap between you and the book, between your experience and Andre Breton's experience. Well, that leads us to try to start in a simple place about, it's not so simple, but how like attracts like, and other ideas that Paul Kammerer had about mechanism for seriality, because it's important to recognize that Kammerer was a biologist, and he wanted to get to explanations in the science as much as he understood it. And how did he talk about seriality and the potential explanations? And then as you talk about that, let's wax into let's wax into your Nadia stories.
Okay, well, the book consists of 16 chapters, and each one is devoted to a particular topic that explains seriality. He has mathematical principles of seriality. Uh, there, he goes into metamary and the meme. These are all, scientific terms to explain how, in nature, animals have an inherent memory that allows them to carry on, genetics. Uh, Paul Kammerer wrote a book called The Inheritance of Acquired Characteristics. That was what he was best known for, not the book on seriality. And he did experiments with midwife toads. Toads, as you know, normally mate on land, and they have these lumpy bodies, so they're able to grasp their mate. But he had this great idea. He loved lizards and toads and amphibians. He named his daughter Lacerta after one of his lizard samples. So he was an odd guy, a fun guy. And so some of these stories are in his book. But he used his background in biology and zoology and herpetology to come up with theories of how coincidence happen. So, but getting back to the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So he did experiments with this midwife toad and threw it in water and said, it's going. Frogs normally mate, and when they mate in the water, and they have these little suction cups on their hands so they can grasp their mate. So he said, in a generation or two, I'm going to get this midwife toad to grow these nuptial pads so that it can grasp its mate. And I'm going to change, the way genetics is seen, not from evolution, having an animal evolve over millions of years. And I'm going to do it in my laboratory, in a few generations and document it. So he did. And he's like, hey, it's starting to grow nuptial pads. Look over here. And some detractors of his came out. One of them is one of the scions of the Barnes and Noble enterprise, and his name was Gladwin Kingsley Noble, and he was an American. And he said, "I think you're faking these results, and I'm going to prove it." So they went to no ends to disprove his, and they said, "You've injected the specimens with India ink." Kammerer was so incensed about this that was one of the things that led to his suicide. But so Kammerer was a biologist who performed experiments on animals, not human beings. Jung was a psychiatrist and a psychologist who was also a doctor. But Kammerer used his examples from nature to show how animals can camouflage themselves and look like other animals. So is that a coincidence that, for instance, a butterfly has a pattern that looks like a snake? So that when a bird is flying overhead, it'll say, "Oh my God, well, that's a tasty butterfly. Wait, that's a snake." So he was fascinated by these things and thought that's more than a coincidence. There is an underlying law. So he explained seriality in these 17 chapters. That's an example of just one. One is called Imitation in Nature. So it's fascinating how he used his own experience to explain a topic that at the time was considered to be in the realm of the metaphysical. Uh, and basically at the time, uh, it sort of discredited him because, people thought that he was half Jewish. And this was in Austria at the time. And people were scared in Germany, were scared of the Kabbalah and this mysticism. So when he wrote The Law of Seriality, it discredited a lot of his experiments in biology, which today are considered epigenetics, which is somewhat validated. So it is a shame that because of people's prejudices against, uh, you know, um, metaphysics, that they would discount his scientific approach, to studying seriality and trying to explain it again using mathematics, physics. He introduces, some theorems of Einstein in the book, and he does a very good job of explaining it because, once again, he's a polymath and a very quick study. So I think the book is very, very valuable because you can approach the study of coincidence not just from a metaphysical standpoint, but from scientific standpoint. And
Well,
you can come.
why don't you give us another example? Imitation is one, but give us another example of an explanation that Kammerer used for some of these serialities.
Yeah, there's another example. It's called the mneme, M-N-E-M-E, and it was designed by a gentleman named Richard Seaman, who was a German, and it refers to an inherent or genetic memory that is not stored in the brain, but seems to be stored somewhere in a body's cells that allow it to carry on information that is going to be given to the next generation. And it's a mysterious thing. It's called an engram or an engram complex. So in other words, let us say, I'm just going to give you an example. It's very, very difficult to explain for me because I'm not I can translate, but I
It was
don't.
hard for me to understand reading it, so go ahead.
Right. So I'll give an example from my own life or whatever. So let us say that in my engram repository or this meme of myself, or you, Dr. Beitman, somebody in your past, or somebody maybe not even genetically related to you, but something influenced one of your ancestors and imprinted on your genetic code or this engram complex, which may be in a cell or somewhere else, the memory of, let's say, a girl named Nadia. Okay. And somehow you have received it as a virus or as some type of information download into your system that allows you to connect with somebody else in your future with that name that has the same proclivities and the same personality as that person, Nadia. So you are you were put in the same position that that individual was before, and you don't know where you got it from. Animals find themselves in this situation. Like a butterfly doesn't say to itself, well, I'm going to make a pattern of a snake on my wing so that I can scare birds away. All right. The butterfly doesn't know where he got that from. So I don't know where I get this camouflage that allows me to blend in with certain people and attract Zachs and attract Nadias and attract things that I've read about. Here's an example of another one. I was sitting in Rogan Art Cafe in Towson, and I was with a friend of mine who had PTSD, and he was in the Vietnam War. And I just happened to have a copy of your book, Connecting with Coincidence, on the table. And I said, Ron, I think this can help you. Tell me about your coincidences. And there's somebody, a psychiatrist, that uses coincidence to help people that have PTSD. So he got up, and then I looked on the wall, and then there was a beautiful pastel of this young boy. And I said, wow, what a great painting this is. I've been here before, but I never noticed it. And so I looked close up, and I saw a business card, and it said the artist's last name was Beitman, Beitman, and it's spelled the same way. And I looked at your book, and it was on the table. And then I looked at the painting. Ron comes back, and I said, Ron, look at this, Beitman, all these. And I said, he says, that's a common name. And he said, it's Bateman. I said, no, it's Bitman. It can't be. So I looked it up on Google. 55 people in the United States have that name. So that's 1 in a million. So in other words, I don't know where I got off on that, but that
Yes,
is an
you were you're describing engrams, and this is an
right,
example of a seriality involving Beitman.
right.
And there aren't a lot of us around with that name, and you came up with a number. But you
That's
were
why I'm
also,
here today, though. But you see, that's why I decided to contact you, because I thought it was so striking as an example of a coincidence that I was influenced. In other words, let's say I brought this book
yeah.
and that triggered an engram, okay, with that painting. That painting had been there before, months before I even heard about your book. So what came first? This is the interesting thing about these embedded memories that and Kammerer, this is just one aspect of, again, there are 16 chapters. I don't want to go into each one, so I'm just picking one right now to tell you about. So the engram, or the mneme, by a guy named Richard Seaman, who is a German guy who incidentally was sent, either committed suicide or went to a concentration camp because he was um, can't remember. I think he was a Nazi, but he committed suicide or something. So, but anyway, he came up with this theory. So, Kammerer used this. It's just an example of one way to explain coincidence. In other words, it's an embedded memory. The other thing that Kammerer talked about was form energy.
Well, let's just for a second, because it just happened. My son, older son, is in Berlin, and I have three cousins and an uncle who were murdered in death camps in the 40s, 1940s. And my son went to a library in East Germany just yesterday to look up some Nazi history, um, and then came home and found a reference to my grandmother's being able to get reparations from the German government. The library that my son had gone to was in the 1940s an orphanage for kids. And the orphanage became the library. And in the message about my grandmother, it referred to that orphanage about where my cousins were. And that just happened today. So the orphanage thing struck my son, and he felt sick when he left that library was an orphanage. And when he told me about it today, I started crying and felt the pain and terror, I thought, of my cousins as they were being taken away.
Yes, you see, that's what I was talking about, the Engram complex. In other words,
Yes.
and particularly with relatives also. And what you just said, of course, I lived in Berlin and I know the place that you're talking about. I lived there for 2 years. I was stationed there, and that's where I worked as a cryptologic linguist when I was in the military. So again, so here's one for you right now. Here's a copy, the original copy of the Law of Seriality. And talking about Nazism, I believe that many copies of this book were burned in the Munich book burnings. I just happen to have found one at exorbitant cost, an original copy. And it has, you're talking about libraries. So there's a library stamp on this from
I can't
Klagen.
see it. I can't
Well,
see
it's
it.
from,
Oh,
it's from Klagenfurt, Austria. Okay, it's not from Berlin. However, I'll put it up here so that everybody can see maybe.
there's another stamp there, and
Yeah, it
you have
says
to read.
Klagen. Well, I'll read it to you, but it says
Yes.
Klagenfurt, Austria. So years ago, I was in Klagenfurt, Austria with my son on a tour of World War II historical sites, including concentration camps, and I wanted my son to see them. So we went to Austria, and I was in this small town named Klagenfurt. So it's ironic that the very book that I should find, the only book, the original book by Paul Kammerer, should have been once in the library of Klagenfurt, a town that I had spent so much time with my son years ago. So again, that's another thing where a relative of yours that you had visited a place of high energy, for instance, like the Holocaust is a time when a lot of people met horrible ends, and there's a great deal of psychic energy. Paul Kammerer talks about that as well in his book. I'm not sure which chapter, but historical events that involve death, that involve tragedy, even small events that involve anxiety tend to trigger. This is what form energy, and it leads into what I was just trying to talk to you about, something called form energy or morphic energy. And there's a great book on that by Rupert Sheldrake called Morphic Resonance. How one vibrational frequency, for instance, on a guitar string, can influence another guitar string. So you have to hit that string. There has to be some sort of impact, some sort of interaction. So let's say years ago, you're in a place of high energy, vibrational frequency. It can send a vibrational frequency or it can trigger a similar reaction that could be years away, regardless of time or space, and trigger somebody else to have that same emotion, that same vibrational frequency. Again, this is something that Kammerer discussed that people gloss over. That's in his book. If people would read it in detail, that's why I thought it was so important to translate this, so I could have somebody like you find out more about it and use it. So it is a big book, and it has a lot of theories, but that's just one of
You know,
them.
what you just described with Engrams relates directly to people having a sense that their ancestors are communicating with them. And it's usually done as like something through death, and they're still alive in the, I call it the psychosphere, where there are entities floating around that communicate with us.
Right.
Um, but this is a more physically based explanation that's resonance and vibration, which we can get into the difference between the physical and the, we'll call it metaphysical, or rather the vibrational of higher, uh, higher consciousness or lesser frequencies. It's more frequent down here, it's heavier, and then it's lighter up there. We can talk about that. I think there's a continuum and they're all related to each other, but this becomes a way for understanding that my son's experience, how that also vibrated with me, came from that place. It's like there's a memory in the place.
Exactly. Yeah. The other thing too is I just wanted to talk about this very, very briefly, is the theory of retrocausality. Paul Kammerer opposes this in his book and asks, is it possible that the present can influence the past? After a discussion with Einstein. Now, Einstein, as you know, came up with this theory of, well, I'm not sure if he came up with it, but quantum entanglement. And but this is years.
He didn't believe it.
Exactly, right, right. He didn't come up with it, but he just, I think the Podolsky Rosen,
Yeah.
right, because it refuted his law of, time and space. So in other words, but he was somehow, there was a discussion, I believe, between Kammerer and Einstein at one point. So in the book, Kammerer posits this question, which I think is somehow in relation to Einstein, that is it possible that the present can influence the past? We know this today as retrocausality or quantum entanglement. Uh, a professor looked over my section on physics in my book and made sure that it sounded okay, because I don't know anything about physics. But he did say that entanglement does not mean that one particle, atomic particle, uh, escapes the speed of light and is able to simultaneously interact with another particle billions of light years away. He says that at one time these particles were together, that they were entangled, and then they became separate, and so that's why one can influence the other. So Kammerer's whole take on seriality is that this is a law of unity, that there is no such thing as metaphysical and science. I want to unite physics and religion, if you will, and make a law of seriality that can create world peace. Kammerer was a pacifist, and he was an anti-war advocate. And again, he was half Jewish. He was discriminated against, whether he committed suicide or whether he was suicide-ed, because there is some conspiracy about that. We don't know. But he did come up with a lot of theories to suggest that what would later come out as retrocausality, that you can go back in time, that there is no such thing as time, that we are timeless, and that we can influence, things that happened in the past, which doesn't make any sense at all because we wouldn't be here. So you have to think about these things and why he said these things. And when he published this book, The Law of Seriality, it ruined his chances of becoming a full professor, because people thought that this was mumbo jumbo and that it's way out there. So again, when I translated this book, I wanted people to take it seriously, to take a look at it and make sure that is it relevant today? How can it help people? How could it, let's say, help people such as yourself that are working on and have already published books that help people to understand these events that you just went through right now, that can be very, very traumatic, and maybe go back into the past, revisit the past, look at the past as a symbol leading up to um, your life. In your book, you mentioned, I think there was a guy named Gibbs Williams, who was a Freudian psychologist, said we create coincidences to solve problems.
Right, right.
So in other words, it's more than just a science. It's more than just let's read this book, The Law of Seriality, and then memorize all these facts and try to find out where it comes from. Let's use the law of seriality to psychoanalyze ourselves, to try to find out that we are all connected, and to prevent, tragedy from happening, because that's what happened when people don't follow the law of seriality, to know that we are all connected. I think that's a message, and I really liked what you discussed in your book about that we're in a waking dream, and that is my interpretation of what he tried to get across. And again, he sort of engrammed himself upon me when I met him, and he's saying this. It's sort of like, I'm a medium. I almost feel that way, like he's trying to tell me, hey, read my book and realize its message, which got me killed, or I committed suicide and went crazy. But forget about that. Let's just say that he lives on, and in his book. And when I read him, he comes alive. When you read this book, it's written in Austrian dialect, and those people were very, very romantic and charming, and they, very verbose, like myself. Well, I don't know if I'm romantic or charming, but very verbose. And so I've always been that way. So who knows? Maybe I'm reincarnated from, a literary reincarnation from Paul Kammerer. So
Well,
anyway.
you got to wonder about that, about how it came to be in a more, let me say, metaphysical or meta level, preferring that you are so immersed, and not only in Paul Kammerer, but also in Andre Breton's Nadia, who the book was published when he died, when
Yes, the same year.
Kammerer
Yeah.
died. So
Yeah.
I mean, that's another seriality. It's like, oh, what is that? Because the 1926 has a lot of meaning to you in both instances. And so how are you in this position? Sometimes you're not going to be able to answer those questions. They become difficult, and you have to just do what you're doing. And what you're describing about the interconnectedness of all of us, and not just with human beings, but also with the animals around us, the plants, the trees around us, and the earth on which we are living, that we're interconnected, interdependent, and this theme is arising more and more as the polarities and fragmentation of humanity is getting worse, which means, as I've been able to see, that when there's a lot of turmoil, more coincidences come in. When things are random appearing, you get more synchronicities and you tend to be more alert to them. So this is a time when we are going to be seeing more coincidences just based on that simple observation of human beings and some past things. So, and you're bringing that message from Paul Kammerer to us, and I thank you for that.
Well, it's a great honor. I mean, I feel like I've been chosen for this, and I had no way of avoiding it. But let's say Andre Breton felt like he had to write this book about Nadia. As a matter of fact, she knew ahead of time that he would write about her, and he said, "You need to write a book about me." And he goes, "Perhaps I will." And so he ended up doing it, not because I think that he said, "Well, I remember that I promised her to do this," but it was a way of exercising her. And when he did it, a lot of people found it very touching that he would write about this story. And then other people found it like he was using their relationship to write this story. But I don't think that was his purpose. It was like automatic writing. It just came to him, and he wrote the book with stream of consciousness. So that's what surrealism is. And I think Paul Kammerer is sort of the same way. I mean, a lot of his writing in this book is stream of consciousness. He just goes on and on and on and on, and we let him, and we find it entertaining. And I think, when we go on and on, and I get off track sometimes, but I have these wonderful conversations in my restaurant about coincidence. And it actually helps, because people are like, hey, let's go to the restaurant and talk with Jason, and let's see what he's into next. And we sit at these tables, and it goes on, and there's wine, and there's and there are discussions about everything, and I seem to attract these people more and more. So in other words, it works in your life to attract to find people who are like-minded and to have these wonderful conversations, because we're not fighting, we're agreeing on something, because coincidence happens to all of us. And what it means, I think, is irrelevant. It means that we're all connected, and that it's a joy to meet somebody, let's say, and to help that person, like, let's say, Nadia, even if it's only for a few minutes of your life. It's a joy to connect with your son, who went through, and your ancestors went through this horrible Holocaust. However, you're connecting with your son, and they were probably, looking up in heaven or wherever, the other dimension that they are, saying, we made this happen and brought these people together through this great tragedy. We are using, on the other side of the portal, this thing called coincidence, and sending these entities to you so that you can come together. And so I think that's the healing power of it. And I know what you do in psychiatry using it. And I support that. I try to do that in my own life with my books. So when I give a copy, or hopefully sell a copy of this book sometime to someone so I can stay alive here, is that I feel like I'm giving them a gift. I also say that it will place you under the spell of coincidence, because Kammerer says that in his book, that when you read this book, it will place you under the spell. And he uses that word, which got him in trouble, because, you see, they thought, it's the Kabbalah, this is some mysticism. But he meant it sort of like, almost like a virus. In other words, it's something that is inherent in nature. When you think about it, it will happen. So anyway, I suppose we materialized one another here at this place and time to discuss that
We did.
phenomenon.
And the idea of merging science and religion has been around for a while now. I first ran across it with the wickedest man in the world named Aleister Crowley, who had a tarot card deck that I've studied for many decades. And he was trying the 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 aim of religion and the methods of science was one of the lines that I learned from him, that just make that whole idea more clear. And now more people who are scientists, who get their minds blown by having coincidence happen, are saying there's something else going on around here, and they try to do the same thing. So there's a movement going on of people wanting to do that. And one way to have that happen, we thought, as part of the Coincidence Project, is to have a coincidence cafe. And we did, online. But you, Jason, have a coincidence cafe going
Yeah,
on.
literal one.
And that's what I
Uh,
was looking for. I wanted to have literal ones. I mean, brick and mortar ones where people
yeah.
could do just what you're doing. So I imagined, and now you're telling me what you've got.
Well, if I may interject, about a year ago, I thought to myself about how many coincidences happened to me at the restaurant. And the restaurant's called the Orchard Marketing Cafe. So I said, I'm going to write a book for my customers and feature my customers in there, the Zachs and the Nadias, and write little short stories. And I'm going to call the book Coincidence Cafe. So that is, so you see how this works. It's very, yeah. But then
That's why this.
I
That's why.
realized there were some books called Coincidence Cafe. So I said, I've got to come up with another one, like Cafe Coincidence or Synchronicity, something or other. So I'm still thinking about a title, but I may not use that. It may not be necessary. But thank
Are
you
there,
for,
so there are other
you used
books?
it.
There are other books with that title? That's
I believe so. Cafe Coincidence Cafe, I think, was one. There's stuff out there that you
eh,
just Google it and somebody owns the domain name, or you have to be careful. So
yeah, and it's one of the
maybe.
principles of coincidence is if you've thought of it, somebody else has, probably. Uh, and we may have thought about it before the books came out, we may not have, but there's information, and I think Kammerer was into this also, that's floating around us. Um, and when he was talked about like attracting like, which has been a kind of an overdone mantra in the US and other places now, there's still something to it. Could you talk about how he addressed like and attracting like?
Yeah, that's one of the chapters in his book. It's like there are similarity coincidences and sameness coincidences. There are affinity coincidences where, and he uses magnetism, and he always uses science. So he talks about the polarity and reversed and positive magnetism. It's very technical, but basically he said that the electromagnetic energy of a particle or a human of a human body or an animal body or a living being or living body in nature. That's what it's called, a living body in nature. That's the exact translation from German. Uh, Carries with it a certain vibrational or magnetic frequency that attracts, because of its poles, negative and positive poles, things that are similar to it, because that individual or that thing, and sometimes it can attract things that are opposite it because of the negative polarity, or sometimes it can repel. So he uses magnetism to describe, this attractive cycle, as well as the law of inertia, okay, or gravity of an object. So without going into tremendous amount of technical detail, you just have to read the book, uh, because
Hold it
I'm
up
terrible.
again. Hold it up
Oh my God.
again.
Okay, here we go. So yeah,
What's it
so
called? The Law of Seriality by
law of
Paul
seriality.
Kammerer.
Yes,
Okay.
and inside here, I mean, you can see all of the different sections and chapters, and I think one of them is on the law of attraction. So yeah,
Yeah, it
principle,
is.
yeah. So yeah, imitations and bodies of, I mean, it just goes on and on and on.
He
So
does go on and on, which is why he needs to be summarized. Um,
exactly.
and you've got the raw data from which AI probably when can put that in and get a summary of what Paul Kammerer did for explanations.
Right. Here's one
Uh,
called The Inertia of Bodies and Forces. And he uses a quote by Schiller: "And the moons wind themselves to and fro on the same eternal spindle." So there's a lot of poetry in here too. So if
and some great quotes at the beginning of each chapter.
oh, they're
They're
feisty.
really they're really good ones in there. I got to mention Lamarck and Lamarckian genetics as a precursor to what Cameron was talking about, simply because when I ran across Lamarck, I said there's got to be something to this, and this is when I was in college or something, and there is. And Cameron tried to show it, but the geneticists, the Darwinians, didn't like it. Just like they don't like to have their ways of thinking about the world change. They get mad when people try to suggest evidence that goes against the way they think about things. But let's go to as we come near the end of our conversation, the dangers, as you might see them, and Kammerer's life might illustrate, of of being involved with the study of coincidences.
Right. I was mentioning earlier that they determined, and in this great book by Klaus Taschwer, which I just held up, which is a biography of Kammerer, he says that some of the biographers of Kammerer, including Arthur Koestler, were wrong, because Kammerer was not necessarily discredited just because he of his midwife toad scandal, or because he was Jewish, but because the Law of Seriality, when it came out in 1919, was his curse. In other words, because he was labeled as a Kabbalist, and that he was seen as someone who is not using science and is using religion, let's say, to explain science, and that was a danger because Hitler's Mein Kampf had come out the year before Kammerer died, and the Nazi Party was growing, and they were neo-Darwinists, and they believed in evolution. So the danger is that when there is a political movement going on at the time, which was happening at the time, and you are very brave and you continue to advocate for a certain philosophy, such as you're a pacifist, or you believe in world peace, bringing people together, and so forth and so on, that science and the people that run the scientific organizations, which at the time was Nazi Germany, and there were some elements of that in the United States as well, that you risk being labeled as a kook and a nut, and your theories are thrown out the door. Here's an example of one that's happening in the United States today. There was an experiment called the PAIR experiment, the Princeton Energy Applied Research Lab, that did experiments in the 1970s up until recently about um, uh, paranormal phenomena. It was shut down just recently because of supposedly its inability to um, to uh, to find answers to some of these phenomenon. In other words, 100% answers. And so it lost its funding and it was shut down. But they spent millions of dollars in taxpayer funded research to prove, let's say, remote viewing or life after death. And they bought all kinds of technical instruments. So the danger is that when a society's organizational structure or political structure changes, it can slow down or completely terminate the advancement of something that might be worth exploring. And that's going on today. So I think his book is kind of a warning to people that don't try to look for mainstream don't try to look for mainstream funding for your research. If you're trying to find out something, don't go to universities, or I mean you can, but just be aware that you're at their beck and call. So Kammerer was a lone wolf. Some of our best scientists have been lone wolves. Tesla himself, not the company Tesla, but the inventor himself was a lone wolf, and he died a lone wolf. So we see this throughout history, that people that are embattled, that that have these great ideas and notions, are often discredited. So that is the warning, I think, that Kammerer sends us. You're going to have to go it alone, and you're going to have to be brave. And it may be a generation or 100 years until you're brought back. So it's almost 100 years since Kammerer's death, and here he is again. So make of it what you will, but be warned, because there are people out there who it may threaten. So
Well, we're at it again here with the synchronicity thing. There appeared to be a greater movement now than there ever could be in Kammerer's time, or Jung was frightened too of exposing the synchronicity idea. That's why it didn't publish his monograph until near the end of his life. Now it looks like it's not so dangerous. What is your view of that?
I don't think the concept is dangerous, but what you can do with it is dangerous. For instance, there was someone who came out, I just saw in the news today, it was a prediction company that you could make bets on who's going to win the election, for instance. And he bet that Trump would win the election. And he was shut down and raided by the FBI. So in other words, when you become too close to discovering something, it's a very, very powerful tool. Okay, and there are a lot of entities out there, I still believe, that it could threaten, including stockbrokers, and we have this Bitcoin phenomenon that's going on. So one of the aspects of Paul Kammerer's, one of the chapters that he talks about, is how gamblers are able to use seriality to win bets. And it's quite technical, but if you look at it, you can see that is the danger of it. In other words, seriality and coincidence theory itself is out there, and you can talk about it. But when you start using it and employing it and then achieving results, that is where the danger, even he says, can come in. So you can use it positively or negatively. And I think there are entities out there today that know this. And I think they're using them as we speak. So that's kind of the conspiracy angle
Oh,
of.
there's books about creating coincidences uh, on the world stage that are that are manufactured to make people believe that there's something that's going to happen in the direction that the coincidence suggests, but it's all done on a stage rather than it just happens. What are some of the other potential dangers as people studying coincidences and might want to use them to help recognize the interconnectedness of human beings with not just each other, but nature as well? What are some of the dangers you see there?
Well, I think that the positivity of it outweighs the dangers, but again, it's the intent of the person who is doing it. It's not the dangers of the system itself that's inherent. I think it's the who is doing it. For instance, yourself, you're a psychiatrist and you use it in your practice. Obviously, that's positive. a stockbroker that is trying to fleece all of his clients and then escape to Bermuda is another story. So in other words, it depends on who you are. If you're Adolf Hitler and you're trying to take over the world and you've discovered that you can put spells on people, then we've got a dangerous situation. So in other words, it's the individual themselves. So you have to be careful who you talk to, because you may meet a psychopath, and you may tell, and psychopaths are extremely intelligent people, and you can tell them that, oh yeah, I conjured up this person, this person named Nadia. So a psychopath may have some really evil intent, or may have, well, I don't think all psychopaths are evil, but I think they may have been misled, and they may want to hurt someone that's hurt them, and so they may be able to conjure up a situation which may not be the optimal for you. So you have to be careful in your own associations
Who
with
you
people.
talk with, careful about who you talk to, but culturally, I'm asking about, just like you're talking about political systems, and we're getting into an ideology that will tend to be much more materialistic than already is what we have, at least politically in the United States. What kind of dangers do you see in studying, talking about, and using meaningful coincidences in the upcoming environment?
Well, sort of talking about coincidences, and the book has gotten me into not trouble, but being labeled as someone who needs to see a psychiatrist,
Still
because
happening, yeah, yeah.
yeah, because for instance, I have this friend that I was telling you about, and I said, hey, listen, hey, guess what happened to me the other day? And I tell him about some of the coincidences. He's like, Jason, you should really talk to someone about this, because these things happen to me all the time, and I just so what are they? It's just chance. It's just ignore these things. What do they mean? If you keep thinking about them, you're going to kill yourself. You're going to be, and I've seen this happen to people. This is an obsession, and I really care about you, and I'm really concerned about you. And for instance, I had a girlfriend that died in a plane crash years ago, and I keep talking about her because that was sort of my way of sort of, getting it out of my mind, not getting it out of my mind, but dealing with it. When someone passes away, you want to talk about that person. But I talked about it to such an extent. He says, you really need to talk to someone about this. And I said, I'm talking to you. And I see people that look like her. I see people with the same name as her come in, and I see it all the time. Here's some pictures I took of people. He said, you're going around taking pictures of people? I said, yeah, because look, there's a resemblance. I just came across a double. And he said, what did the people say when you took their picture? They said, oh my God, we'd love to be part of this. And we're glad to be of help. So, again, I encountered someone who's a friend of mine that, that thinks I'm a nut and thinks this is dangerous. And yet the people that I speak to, the majority of the people are charmed by it. And they think we would more, we understand that you went through something traumatic, and I'm glad to be of help. I'm glad I made your day.
Good.
So there,
That's good.
yeah,
That's
so
good. We're going to have to wrap it up, and I would like you to tell us again the name of your Coincidence Cafe, the one you use for your restaurant, and what its address is. And I want you to send it to me so that I can include it in your bio, because I want to encourage people. It was Towson, Maryland, is where you are.
it
Uh,
is in Towson, yes. So the name of the restaurant is called the Orchard Market and Cafe. It's been there 35 years. It's at 8815 Orchard Tree Lane, and the 88 corresponds to, you see, the infinity symbol on my book. So, that's
Sometimes,
another. That's
sometimes I've been told, and I'm going to tell you, you overdo that, finding the analogies, finding the metaphors. It's fun, but the meaning of it can get. I have to stop myself from doing it. It's another what thing I'm
that's
telling you about. I just see it in you. It's just too much fun, but it's like,
right.
okay, so it there's other things to do with my thinking, but that's another question. So I want to thank you very much. For being on the show, and even more for bringing Paul Kammerer to me live and presentation through you, and to have at least some part of our population have some idea about who this remarkable guy was and still is. So thank you very much, Jason, for being with me today.
Thank you. It was a great honor. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thank you for allowing me to blurb the Coincidence Cafe for you and your own Coincidence Cafe. And I'm looking forward to reading your new book, Life Changing Synchronicities. Can't wait to read it.
Thank you very much.